The blizzard hit the high plains of eastern Colorado on March 10, 1886, with a violence that stunned even veteran settlers. Temperature dropped from 40 degrees above zero to 28 degrees below zero in less than 3 hours. Wind screamed across the grasslands at 80 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally with such force it felt like being sand-blasted. Visibility dropped to zero. The storm that would later be called the Great Blizzard of '86 had arrived, and it would kill hundreds of people and thousands of cattle across the Plains states. In the scattered homesteads around the settlement of Lyman, settlers fought for survival. Conventional log cabins, even well-built ones, shuddered under the wind assault. The cold penetrated every gap, every crack, every imperfection in the chinking. Despite fires burning constantly, interior temperatures plummeted. Families huddled together, burning furniture when firewood ran out, watching helplessly as frost formed on interior walls, and the cold crept closer despite their desperate efforts. John Harrigan's cabin, considered one of the best built in the area, maintained an interior temperature of 18 degrees Fahrenheit with a fire that consumed half a cord of wood in 12 hours. His wife and 3 children survived, but all suffered frostbite. The cabin's log walls, 9 inches of solid pine, proved inadequate against the extreme cold and relentless wind. But in one cabin, 5 miles northeast of Limon, a man sat comfortably reading a book by lamplight in an interior temperature of 57 degrees Fahrenheit. His fire had burned for 2 hours the previous evening and was now completely out. The wind that was tearing at every other structure in the county could not penetrate his walls. The cold that was killing people and animals across the region could not reach his interior. His cabin, the one everyone had laughed at, the one they'd called the mud house, was the only structure for miles around where the blizzard could not get inside. The man's name was Miguel Santos, a Mexican immigrant who'd arrived in Colorado in 1882. And the reason his cabin stayed warm while others froze was simple. He'd covered the entire structure, walls and roof, with a 2-foot-thick coating of mud. Not just any mud, a carefully engineered mixture of clay, sand, straw, and animal hair that his ancestors had used for centuries in Mexico. A material that settlers had mocked as primitive and useless. A covering that looked so ridiculous that neighbors had ridden from miles away just to laugh at the mud house. Until the blizzard came. Until Miguel sat warm while his neighbors froze. Until the mud that everyone had mocked became the only thing standing between survival and death. This is the story of how one man's knowledge of traditional adobe construction combined with systematic application created the most thermally stable cabin on the Colorado Plains, how 2 feet of mud could outperform 2 feet of wood, and how what looked like primitive construction was actually advanced material science that wouldn't be fully understood for another century. Miguel Santos was born in 1855 in a small village outside Chihuahua, Mexico. His family, like most families in that region, lived in adobe houses. These weren't simple mud huts. They were sophisticated structures built from sun-dried bricks made of clay and straw, with walls 2 to 3 feet thick. The houses stayed remarkably cool in the brutal Mexican summer and comfortably warm in the cold desert winters. As a child, Miguel helped his father make adobe bricks. The process was specific and required knowledge passed down through generations. The clay had to be the right type, not too sandy, not too pure. The straw had to be mixed in specific proportions. The bricks had to be formed in wooden molds and dried slowly to prevent cracking. The walls had to be finished with adobe plaster, multiple thin layers applied and smoothed to create a weather-tight surface. Miguel learned that adobe walls worked because of 2 properties. First, thermal mass. The thick clay walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, moderating temperature swings. Second, insulation. Despite being dense and solid, adobe had surprisingly good insulating properties. The air pockets in the straw, the thickness of the walls, and the ability of clay to resist heat transfer all contributed to keeping interior temperatures stable. In 1880, Miguel crossed into Texas seeking work and opportunity. He spent 2 years working ranches, saving money, learning English. In 1882, he filed a homestead claim in eastern Colorado. The land was flat grassland with good soil but harsh weather. Summer heat could exceed 100 degrees. Winter cold could drop to 30 below. The extremes were more severe than anything in Mexico, but Miguel believed adobe construction could handle it. He spent the summer of 1882 building his cabin. The frame was conventional enough. Log posts at the corners, roof beams made from cottonwood, hauled from a creek bottom 10 miles away. But Miguel had no intention of building a standard log cabin. He would build an adobe-covered structure, using techniques his family had perfected over centuries. The basic walls were built from logs, but lighter and more roughly fitted than a conventional cabin. These logs weren't meant to be the primary thermal barrier. They were simply structural framework. Miguel positioned them vertically rather than horizontally, creating posts every 3 feet around the perimeter. Between these posts, he wove smaller branches and twigs, creating a lattice framework. His neighbor, John Harrigan, visited in July and watched this construction with confusion. Harrigan had built his own cabin the previous year using standard methods. He knew what cabins were supposed to look like. This wasn't it. "Those walls won't keep out anything," Harrigan said. "I can see through the gaps. Wind will blow right through those branches." "These walls are not finished," Miguel explained. "This is only framework. The real wall comes next." "What real wall? You planning to chink between those branches? That'll take forever and won't work well. I will cover everything with mud, thick mud, 2 feet thick." Harrigan stared. "You're going to cover your cabin in mud? Miguel, that's insane. Mud isn't a building material. Mud is what you get stuck in. It'll wash away in the first rain. It'll crack in the first freeze. You're wasting your time." "In Mexico, we build with adobe for hundreds of years. Adobe is mud brick, very strong, very warm. I will use same material, but apply it differently." "All right." "This isn't Mexico. This is Colorado. We have real winters here. Mud won't protect you from 20 below. You need solid logs, thick walls, good chinking, not mud." Miguel didn't argue further. He simply continued his work. Harrigan left, shaking his head, convinced Miguel was making a terrible mistake that he'd regret come winter. Miguel began mixing his adobe plaster in August. The mixture was precise. 3 parts clay-rich soil from a specific location near a creek, 2 parts sand for structure, 1 part chopped straw for reinforcement. Water added gradually until the consistency was right, thick enough to hold shape, but wet enough to work smoothly. He also added horsehair when available, providing additional fibrous reinforcement. The application process was labor-intensive. Miguel applied the mud by hand, pressing it firmly against the woven branch framework, building up thickness gradually. Each layer, about 2 inches thick, had to dry partially before the next layer could be applied. Too wet, and the weight would cause sagging. Too dry, and the layers wouldn't bond properly. He worked through August and September, layer after layer, building up the walls to 2 feet of total thickness. The work was slow and physically demanding. Each day he could apply perhaps 1 layer to 1 section of wall. The entire process took 8 weeks. A conventional cabin could have been built in 3 weeks. Miguel's mud covering alone took longer than building an entire normal cabin. Word spread through the sparse homestead community that Mexican fellow was covering his cabin in mud, 2 feet of mud, making mud walls like some kind of primitive dwelling. The general consensus was that Miguel didn't understand American building methods and was doing something foolish that would fail when real weather arrived. A group of 3 homesteaders rode over in late September specifically to see the mud cabin. They found Miguel applying the final layers to the roof. Yes, the roof. Miguel wasn't just covering the walls with mud. He was covering the entire structure, including the roof, with the same thick adobe layer. "You're putting mud on your roof?" one of the men asked incredulously. "That's going to be impossibly heavy. And how do you keep it from washing away when it rains?" "The roof frame is very strong. Many heavy beams can support weight. And mud is sloped for drainage. Rain runs off. Does not wash mud away if mud is applied correctly. But winter snow, that'll add even more weight. The whole thing will collapse." Adobe has been used for roofs for many centuries. If built properly, is very strong. Horrorious. The men examined the structure. The walls were now completely covered, smooth and uniform, colored the reddish-brown of the local clay. The cabin looked like it had been carved from a single piece of adobe, rather than built from logs and branches. The roof, also covered with the same material, sloped gently from a center ridge. The entire structure looked foreign, primitive, nothing like a proper American cabin. "It's the strangest thing I've ever seen," one of them said. "Looks like something Indians might build. No offense, Miguel, but I don't think this is going to work out for you. Come winter, you're going to realize you need a real cabin." They left, and within a week, the story had spread to every homestead in the area, Miguel's mud house. Some called it the mud hut. Others called it the adobe folly. Everyone agreed it was ridiculous and doomed to fail. When winter came, Miguel would freeze, or the structure would collapse under snow load, or the mud would crack and crumble. It was just a matter of time. Miguel finished his cabin in early October. The final step was whitewashing the exterior with lime wash, a thin coating that would protect the adobe from moisture and provide additional weather resistance. The interior walls received a similar treatment, smoothed and whitewashed to create a clean, bright surface. The completed cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet, with an 8-foot ceiling at the center, tapering to 6 feet at the walls due to the sloped roof. But the actual interior dimensions were smaller than these numbers suggested because of the wall thickness. 2 feet of adobe on each wall reduced the interior to 12 feet by 16 feet. 2 feet of adobe on the roof reduced ceiling height. The mud took up significant space, but what space it created was remarkable. Even in October, before any fire had been lit, the interior felt stable. The temperature didn't fluctuate with outside conditions. On a day when the outside temperature ranged from 40 degrees in the early morning to 70 degrees in the afternoon, the interior stayed at 55 degrees continuously. The massive thermal mass of the adobe was already moderating temperature swings. Miguel installed a small fireplace, much smaller than conventional cabin fireplaces. He didn't need a large firebox because he understood that the cabin would retain heat efficiently. A small fire would be sufficient. The fireplace was built from adobe rather than stone, keeping with the material theme and adding additional thermal mass to the interior. The first significant cold came in November. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night. Miguel lit small fires in his fireplace, burning for an hour or two each evening. The interior temperature stayed between 55 and 60 degrees. The adobe walls, warmed slightly by the fire and by daytime sun exposure, released that stored heat overnight. The cabin was comfortable with minimal heating. John Harrigan visited in early December. The temperature outside was 20 degrees. Harrigan expected to find Miguel huddled near a fire, struggling with the inadequacy of his mud walls. Instead, he found Miguel comfortable, the fire out, the cabin warm. "It's warm in here," Harrigan said, surprised. "Yes, the mud holds heat, like stone, but lighter and easier to work with." Harrigan touched the wall. It was the same temperature as the air, perhaps 58 degrees. There was no cold radiating from the wall surface like there was in his own log cabin. The adobe seemed to be a uniform temperature throughout. How thick did you say these walls are? 2 feet, 24 inches of adobe. And the roof? Also 2 feet. Harrigan did quick mental calculation. So every surface of this cabin is covered with 2 feet of mud? That's got to weigh. I don't even know. Tons? About 15 tons total. 3 tons for roof, 12 tons for walls. 15 tons of mud sitting on top of logs and branches. How is it not collapsing? The weight is distributed, many support posts, strong roof beams, and adobe, when dry, is very strong, not soft like mud, hard like soft stone. Harrigan examined the interior more closely. The walls were smooth and solid. Tapping them produced a dull thud, not hollow like log walls. They felt more like plaster over brick than like mud. The surface was hard enough that scratching it with a fingernail barely left a mark. I admit it's warmer than I expected, but we haven't had real cold yet. Wait until January. Wait until 20 below. Then we'll see how your mud walls hold up. I believe they will hold up very well. Adobe has kept people warm in cold climates for many centuries. Harrigan left, still skeptical, but less certain of Miguel's failure. The mud cabin was undeniably warmer than it should be. Whether it could handle extreme cold remained to be seen. December brought colder weather. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Miguel's small evening fires maintained interior temperatures between 55 and 62 degrees. His firewood consumption was minimal, perhaps 1/8 of what conventional cabins required. The 15-ton thermal mass of adobe surrounding his living space stored heat from the fire and the modest daytime solar gain, releasing it gradually to maintain stable conditions. But the real test came on March 10, 1886. The blizzard that swept across the plains brought cold and wind that exceeded anything settlers had experienced. The temperature plunge was dramatic and dangerous. The wind was violent and relentless. Every structure was tested beyond its design capacity. Miguel's cabin faced the storm with 15 tons of adobe mass standing between the interior and the killer cold outside. As the temperature dropped and the wind rose, the adobe gave up its stored heat slowly. The thick walls prevented the cold from penetrating quickly. The wind, which was finding every crack and gap in conventional cabins, had no gaps to exploit in Miguel's cabin. The adobe was a continuous monolithic mass with no structural openings except the door and the chimney. The interior temperature dropped as the storm raged, 57 degrees initially, down to 55 by evening, down to 53 by midnight. But there it stabilized. The cold could not penetrate further. The adobe had reached equilibrium where the rate of heat loss to the outside equaled the residual heat being released from the mass. At 53 degrees interior and 28 below outside, the 81-degree difference was maintained by nothing but the thermal resistance of 2 feet of adobe. Miguel slept comfortably under a single blanket. He woke in the morning to find the storm still raging and his cabin still at 53 degrees. No fire had burned overnight. The temperature was cool but not dangerously cold. He lit a small fire, burned it for an hour, and brought the interior temperature back up to 58 degrees. The blizzard lasted 48 hours. During that time, Miguel lived normally in his cabin. Cool, yes, but comfortable and safe. He cooked meals, he read, he slept. The mud walls that everyone had mocked were keeping him alive, while people in conventional cabins were fighting for survival. When the storm finally cleared on March 12th, the devastation across the plains was catastrophic. Hundreds of people dead, thousands of cattle frozen, families found huddled together in their cabins, dead from hypothermia, despite fires that had burned until fuel ran out. The economic and human toll was staggering. Miguel emerged from his cabin healthy and safe. He walked to John Harrigan's homestead and found the family alive but severely affected. All had frostbite. The cabin showed signs of desperate measures, furniture burned for fuel, interior walls damaged where wood had been torn out to feed the fire. Harrigan himself was exhausted and traumatized. "The mud house," Harrigan said when he saw Miguel, "it saved you, didn't it? While we were fighting for our lives, you were safe in the mud house. The adobe kept me warm, not very warm, but warm enough. I am sorry for what you experienced." "How?" Harrigan asked. "How did mud work when logs didn't? My walls are 9 inches of solid pine. Yours are mud. Mud shouldn't be stronger than pine," Miguel explained as best he could. The thickness mattered. 2 feet of adobe provided more insulation than 9 inches of pine. The mass mattered. 15 tons of adobe stored heat and released it slowly. The continuity mattered. Adobe had no gaps, no cracks, no places for wind to penetrate. It was a complete thermal envelope that resisted heat loss in ways that log construction couldn't match. "I need you to teach me," Harrigan said. "Teach me how to build with adobe, or how to cover my existing cabin with it. I can't go through another winter like this. If your mud saved you, I need that mud." If you're fascinated by these traditional building techniques that seemed primitive but actually incorporated sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover the forgotten wisdom of builders from different cultures who understood materials and physics in ways that shame modern assumptions. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss these incredible stories of practical innovation. Word of Miguel's survival and the performance of his mud cabin spread rapidly. Settlers who'd mocked the adobe construction now wanted to learn the technique. Miguel found himself teaching groups of homesteaders how to mix adobe, how to apply it, how to build up thickness gradually. He explained the importance of clay content, proper straw reinforcement, and adequate drying time between layers. Some homesteaders built new adobe cabins from scratch. Others, like Harrigan, decided to cover their existing log cabins with adobe, essentially wrapping them in a thermal mass envelope. This hybrid approach proved effective. A log cabin covered with 18 inches of adobe performed dramatically better than a log cabin alone. The spring and summer of 1886 saw a small adobe construction boom in the Lyman area. 8 new adobe cabins were built. 12 existing cabins were covered with adobe coating. The distinctive reddish-brown color of adobe structures became common in an area that had previously been entirely log construction. The techniques varied as builders experimented. One settler, a man named William Gresham, built a cabin with 3-foot-thick walls, reasoning that if 2 feet was good, 3 feet would be better. He was right. His cabin maintained remarkably stable temperatures with even less heating than Miguel's. But the construction time for 3-foot walls was prohibitive for most people. 2 feet became the standard compromise between performance and construction feasibility. Another settler, Frank Morrison, developed a technique for forming adobe bricks on site and then using them to build walls rather than applying mud plaster directly. This allowed for more consistent construction and faster work once the bricks were made. Morrison's brick method became popular among settlers who had time to plan ahead and could make bricks during warm months for construction later. A third innovation came from a German immigrant named Klaus Weber. He built a conventional log cabin, but then filled the space between logs with adobe mixture rather than using mud chinking. This created a composite wall that combined the structural strength of logs with the thermal mass and insulation of adobe. The technique was faster than covering an entire cabin, but still provided significant performance improvement. The winter of 1886 to 1887 provided further validation. It was another harsh winter, though not as extreme as the blizzard of March. The adobe cabins maintained interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than conventional cabins for equivalent heating input. Firewood consumption in adobe cabins was 1/4 to 1/3 of conventional cabin consumption. A county agricultural agent, Thomas Whitmore, documented the performance differences in a report submitted to the Colorado Territorial Government in March 1887. Whitmore had visited and measured temperatures in various cabins throughout the winter. His findings were conclusive. Adobe construction provided superior thermal performance in the Colorado Plains climate. Whitmore's report noted that adobe cabins maintained average interior temperatures of 53 degrees during cold weather with minimal heating. Conventional log cabins maintained average temperatures of 37 degrees with substantially more heating. The 16-degree difference was attributable primarily to the superior insulation and thermal mass of adobe. The report also documented firewood consumption. Adobe cabins averaged 1.5 cords per month during winter. Conventional cabins averaged 6 cords per month. The 4.5 cord difference per month represented enormous labor savings. At half a day of work per cord, adobe cabin owners saved over 2 days per month of firewood labor compared to conventional cabin owners. The economic advantages extended beyond fuel savings. Adobe construction used local materials, primarily soil, which cost nothing but labor. Log construction required significant timber, which had to be hauled from distant creek bottoms in an area with limited trees. The material cost advantage of adobe was substantial in a region where timber was scarce and expensive. The environmental benefits were also significant. Reduced firewood consumption meant less pressure on sparse timber resources. Areas with adobe construction showed less deforestation than areas with conventional log construction. The soil removed for adobe construction could be replaced by natural erosion over time. The technique was sustainable in ways that heavy timber use was not. By 1890, adobe construction had spread beyond the immediate Lyman area to other parts of eastern Colorado and western Kansas. Settlers in regions with limited timber but good clay soil found adobe particularly valuable. The technique was especially popular among Hispanic settlers from New Mexico and Mexico who had traditional knowledge of adobe construction. A professor from Colorado State Agricultural College, Dr. Harold Jensen, studied adobe cabin construction in 1892 as part of a research project on agricultural building methods. Jensen was interested in understanding why adobe performed so much better than conventional wisdom suggested it should. His analysis focused on the thermal properties of adobe material. He found that dry adobe had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of approximately 1.4 per inch. 2 feet of adobe, 24 inches, provided R 33.6. By comparison, 9-inch pine logs provided approximately R 8. The adobe was more than 4 times more insulating, but insulation alone didn't explain adobe's superior performance. Jensen identified thermal mass as the other critical factor. Adobe had high heat capacity, approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. With 15 tons of adobe in a typical cabin, the total heat capacity was approximately 6,000 BTU per degree. This enormous thermal mass buffered temperature changes, storing heat when available and releasing it when needed. Jensen calculated that Miguel's original cabin had enough thermal mass to store approximately 150,000 BTU if the adobe was warmed from 50 degrees to 75 degrees. Releasing this stored energy over 24 hours provided over 6,000 BTU per hour, sufficient to maintain comfortable temperatures without any active heating in moderate weather. Jensen's published paper, titled Thermal Performance of Adobe Construction in Harsh Continental Climates, appeared in the Journal of Agricultural Engineering in 1893. The paper brought academic credibility to what had been considered primitive construction. Jensen concluded that adobe represents an advanced application of passive thermal design principles. The material's combination of high thermal mass and reasonable insulation creates structures that outperform conventional wood frame construction in climates with significant diurnal or seasonal temperature variations. The recognition didn't change Miguel's life dramatically. He continued homesteading, eventually proving up his claim and gaining full ownership of his land. He married in 1894, wedding a widow named Sarah Thompson, who had 2 children from her previous marriage. Sarah, who'd lived in a conventional log cabin, was amazed by the comfort of the adobe cabin. She later wrote to relatives back east, describing how different winter was in a properly built adobe structure. Together, Miguel and Sarah raised 5 children in the cabin that everyone had laughed at. The children grew up thinking it was normal to be comfortable in winter without burning large amounts of firewood. When they visited friends in conventional cabins, they were shocked by the cold and the constant fire tending required. The adobe cabin stood for 71 years. Miguel lived there until his death in 1928 at age 73. Sarah continued living there until 1934. After her death, one of their sons occupied the cabin until 1953. The structure remained sound and functional throughout this period, requiring only minor maintenance to repair occasional cracks in the exterior plaster. When the cabin was finally abandoned in 1953, a historical society documented its construction before it fell into ruin. The adobe walls were still intact. The roof adobe had eroded somewhat over decades, but the structure beneath remained sound. The cabin had provided comfortable shelter for 3 generations without major rebuilding. Modern building science has validated the thermal principles that made Miguel's mud cabin work so well. Contemporary natural building advocates recognize adobe as one of the most sustainable and thermally efficient building materials available. The high thermal mass and reasonable insulation create structures that are naturally climate responsive, staying cool in summer and warm in winter with minimal energy input. Passive solar design, now recognized as advanced sustainable architecture, incorporates the same principles Miguel used: thermal mass to store energy, adequate insulation to prevent loss, proper orientation to maximize solar gain. These concepts, understood intuitively by traditional builders, are now calculated precisely by modern engineers, but the physics hasn't changed. Mass and insulation work the same in the 21st century as they did in the 19th. Before we continue with the lasting impact of this building technique, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. These stories of cross-cultural knowledge, transfer, and practical problem-solving contain lessons relevant to anyone interested in sustainable building, energy efficiency, or understanding how traditional wisdom often beats modern conventional methods. Don't miss out on these fascinating historical insights. The broader impact of Miguel's work was in demonstrating that traditional knowledge from one culture could solve problems in another culture's context. Mexican and Native American adobe construction traditions had evolved over centuries to deal with temperature extremes. That knowledge, applied to Colorado Plains conditions, proved superior to conventional American timber construction methods. This cross-cultural knowledge transfer was relatively rare on the American frontier. More commonly, settlers dismissed indigenous and non-Anglo building methods as primitive without examining whether they might be effective. Miguel's adobe cabin provided undeniable evidence that primitive methods could outperform advanced ones. The mud that people laughed at worked better than the logs everyone considered proper. The technique's spread followed patterns of cultural community. Hispanic settlers adopted adobe readily, having cultural familiarity with the material. Anglo settlers were more hesitant, but gradually adopted the technique when economic and practical advantages became clear. By the early 20th century, adobe construction in eastern Colorado was no longer considered specifically Mexican or primitive, but simply a sensible building method for local conditions. The Depression era of the 1930s saw renewed interest in adobe construction. Families facing economic hardship couldn't afford expensive building materials. Adobe, made from local soil, cost nothing but labor. Government agricultural programs promoted adobe construction as a way for struggling farmers to build adequate housing with minimal cash outlay. Several New Deal programs specifically included adobe construction training. The Civilian Conservation Corps built adobe structures in several western states. The technique that had been considered primitive and laughable in the 1880s was promoted by the federal government as practical and sensible in the 1930s. World War II brought another wave of adobe construction, particularly in the Southwest. Military bases needed quick, cheap housing for expanded personnel. Adobe construction, which didn't require scarce timber or steel, became valuable for war effort building. Some military structures built during this period remained in use for decades after the war. The environmental movement of the 1970s rediscovered adobe as a sustainable building material. Advocates of natural building pointed to adobe's advantages: local materials, low embodied energy, excellent thermal performance, durability, and recyclability. Adobe construction aligned perfectly with emerging principles of sustainable architecture. Contemporary adobe and rammed earth construction continues in many parts of the world. Modern techniques use stabilizers like cement or lime to improve weather resistance and allow building code compliance. But the fundamental material, earth mixed with fiber and formed into thick walls, remains unchanged from what Miguel used in 1882. The story of Miguel's mud-covered cabin offers several enduring lessons. First, traditional knowledge from other cultures often contains solutions to local problems. Miguel's Mexican heritage gave him construction knowledge that Colorado settlers lacked. The cultural exchange benefited everyone who learned from his example. Second, thermal mass is as valuable as insulation. Contemporary building tends to emphasize insulation, measured by R value, while neglecting thermal mass. Miguel's cabin demonstrated that mass and insulation together create performance superior to either alone. The 15-ton thermal battery of adobe was as important as the R33 insulation value. Third, local materials can outperform imported materials when properly used. Settlers hauling timber from distant locations were using scarce, expensive materials. Miguel, using local soil, was using abundant, free material. The free material, properly applied, worked better than the expensive material. Fourth, appearance is less important than performance. The mud cabin looked primitive and ridiculous to settlers accustomed to log construction. But during the blizzard, appearance didn't matter. Only performance mattered. The ridiculous-looking cabin saved Miguel's life, while conventional-looking cabins failed. Fifth, thickness and mass create stability. 2 feet of adobe was excessive by conventional standards. But that excess was exactly what made the system work. The thickness provided insulation. The mass provided thermal buffering. Both were necessary for the dramatic performance advantage. Finally, mockery is not evidence. Everyone laughed at the mud cabin. Everyone predicted failure. The universal mockery was universally wrong. Social consensus against an idea proves nothing about whether the idea actually works. Results are the only valid test. The neighbors who laughed at Miguel's mud-covered cabin learned a harsh lesson when the blizzard came. While they fought for survival, Miguel sat comfortable behind 2 feet of adobe. The mud they'd mocked became the only thing that worked when the test was survival rather than appearance. John Harrigan, who'd been the most vocal critic of adobe construction, became its strongest advocate after the blizzard. He covered his own cabin with 18 inches of adobe in the summer of 1886. He lived until 1922 and never again experienced cold like he'd suffered in the blizzard. His adobe-covered cabin kept him comfortable for 36 years. William Gresham, who'd built the 3-foot-thick adobe cabin, lived there until 1941. His grandson inherited the property and continued using the cabin as a workshop until 1976. 90 years after construction, the adobe walls remained sound. The structure that took extra months to build provided 3 generations of service. The Great Blizzard of '86 remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in Colorado history. Official estimates suggest over 100 people died in Colorado alone, with hundreds more across the Plains states. Thousands of cattle froze. The economic devastation lasted for years, but in the records of survivors, one detail stands out. Adobe cabin owners survived. Their death rate was essentially 0. The mud that people had laughed at saved every person who lived behind it. Miguel Santos died in 1928, 73 years old, having lived 46 years in the cabin he built with his own hands. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he'd introduced adobe construction to eastern Colorado and that many families owed their lives to the building technique he'd taught them. The mud cabin that everyone had mocked became his lasting legacy. The cabin itself, though long abandoned, remained partially standing until 1987, when the landowner finally had it demolished to clear the site. Before demolition, a preservation group documented the structure and saved samples of the adobe for a local museum. After 105 years, the adobe was still intact, still hard, still recognizable as the material that had saved lives during the worst blizzard in Colorado history. Neighbors laughed when Miguel covered his cabin in mud. They predicted failure and ridicule. They called it primitive and ridiculous. But when the blizzard came, when the test was survival, the mud cabin was the only structure that truly worked. The 2 feet of adobe that looked absurd created an 81-degree temperature difference that meant the difference between life and death. The lesson endures. Sometimes the thing everyone laughs at is the only thing that actually works. Sometimes traditional knowledge from another culture provides better solutions than conventional local methods. Sometimes mud is stronger than wood. And sometimes covering your entire cabin in what everyone calls ridiculous is the smartest thing you can possibly do.